For over 3 years, a married woman in rural Tennessee is accused of carrying on a secret sexual relationship with a local teenage boy. It allegedly started when he was just 15 years old, a kid who loved working on engines, hunting, and fishing in the hills of Sequatchie County. For years, according to people close to him, this affair was hidden right under her husband's nose. But the moment that boy turned 18, the secret exploded into cold-blooded violence. Just hours after an unexpected homecoming on Powerline Road, deputies arrived to find a 41-year-old husband standing in his own doorway, covered in blood. Inside, his 31-year-old wife was bleeding from stab wounds. And in the bedroom, an 18-year-old named Billy Jean Floyd was found stuffed into a trash can, curled into the fetal position. But the most disturbing part of this case isn't just how Billy died. It's what the husband said to police seconds after they found him standing there covered in blood. He wasn't asked whether he was worried about prison. He wasn't asked whether he understood the gravity of what had just happened. Deputies simply asked him if he had any concerns besides his legal troubles. And what he told them is the line that would end up defining this entire case in the eyes of the internet. He said he was worried about his relationship with his wife, because in his words he had offed him. Stay with me, because this case has everything. An alleged years-long relationship with a minor, a marriage built on secrets, a husband with a documented history of violent jealousy, and a killing so calculated in its aftermath that investigators are still trying to piece together whether this was a moment of blind rage or something Jonathan Belk had been planning for a year and a half. Welcome back to Brian's Criminal Unmasking, the channel where we dig past the headlines and expose the hidden motives, secret relationships, and buried warning signs behind the nation's most disturbing crimes. If deep, unfiltered true crime breakdowns are your thing, do me a favor right now, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let's get into it, because this one is going to test everything you think you know about who the real victim is in a story like this. To understand what happened on Powerline Road in March of 2025, you have to go back further. You have to go back to a time when Billy Jean Floyd, a kid everyone in his family affectionately called Lil Bill, was still in high school, still a minor. Still years away from the age most of us consider the dividing line between childhood and adulthood. According to Billy's godmother, a woman named Brandy Smart, Billy had been in a relationship with a married woman named Jada Golston since he was around 15 years old. That is not a typo, and it is not an exaggeration for shock value. That is the claim made publicly by someone who says she watched this boy grow up. Let that sink in for a second. Jada Golston was 31 years old at the time of the killing in March of 2025. If the relationship truly began when Billy was 15, that means it started roughly 3 years earlier, when Jada would have been around 28. A 28-year-old married woman, allegedly beginning something with a boy who hadn't even finished growing up yet. In Tennessee, the age of consent is 18 years old. There is no ambiguity in the law here, and there is no version of this story where a sexual relationship between an adult woman in her late 20s and a 15-year-old boy is anything other than a crime. Depending on the specific circumstances and the age gap involved, Tennessee law recognizes offenses ranging from statutory rape to aggravated statutory rape, precisely because the law understands what a 13-year age gap means when one party is still a child. This isn't a gray area. This isn't a scandalous affair in the way tabloids like to frame illicit adult relationships. If the allegations are accurate, this is a story about the sexual exploitation of a minor by an adult who was not only far older than him, but married to someone else entirely. Sequatchie County Sheriff Bill Phillips was asked directly about these claims when reporters brought them to him. He didn't deny them. He also didn't confirm them outright. What he said was that this was part of the ongoing investigation, that his department still had people out conducting interviews, and that he anticipated more charges could be filed in connection with this case as things developed. That's about as close as a sheriff can get to telling you, without technically confirming anything, that the pieces are lining up. So picture the world Billy Floyd was allegedly living in as a young teenager. By outward appearances, He was just a rural Tennessee kid living the kind of life a lot of people in Sequatchie County would recognize. He liked spending time on four-wheelers. He liked hunting and fishing. He liked getting his hands dirty working on engines, the kind of unglamorous practical skills that get passed down in families like his. His obituary, written by people who loved him, describes exactly that kind of young man. Someone who mostly just wanted to be around his family and friends, tinkering with machines and enjoying the outdoors. And somewhere underneath that ordinary teenage life, according to people who knew him, there was allegedly a secret relationship with an adult woman who was married to someone else. A relationship that, if it started when investigators and family members say it did, began while Billy was still legally a child. This is the part of the story that true crime coverage sometimes glosses over in favor of the more sensational elements, the stabbing, the trash can, the infamous quote. But it deserves to sit at the center of this case, because everything that happened on Powerline Road in March traces back to this arrangement. A married woman, a boy who wasn't even old enough to consent under the law when it allegedly began, and a husband who, according to people close to the family, eventually found out. Here's where the story shifts from a disturbing secret to something far more dangerous. According to Billy's godmother, Brandy Smart, this wasn't a secret that stayed hidden until the very end. At some point, reportedly around a year and a half before the killing, Jonathan Belk allegedly found out about the relationship between his wife and the teenage boy. And according to Brandy, Belk didn't just confront his wife quietly and try to work through it behind closed doors, the way a lot of people might expect in a situation involving infidelity. Instead, Brandy says, Belk made a threat directly connected to Billy's age. She told reporters that Belk had said, at some point before the killing, that once Billy turned 18, he was going to kill him. Take a moment to absorb what that claim actually implies, if true. This isn't a description of a man who lost control in a single chaotic moment of discovery. This is, according to someone who knew the family, a man who allegedly sat with the knowledge of this relationship for roughly a year and a half, and specifically waited for a legal technicality, Billy's 18th birthday, before acting on violence he had apparently already decided on. Why would the number 18 matter to someone allegedly planning violence? It's hard not to read into it. Once Billy was no longer a minor, the calculus of consequences shifts. The situation stops being framed, at least in the eyes of some observers, as a man protecting a child from exploitation, and starts being framed instead as a husband enraged by an unfaithful marriage. If this threat is accurate, it suggests Belk understood exactly what he was allegedly planning and exactly when he intended to carry it out. Sheriff Phillips, again, wouldn't confirm the specific details of this alleged threat when pressed by reporters. He gave the same measured answer he gave about the relationship's origins, that it was part of an active and ongoing investigation, but he did not dismiss it, and he reiterated that additional charges were possible as the investigation continued. Now here's where the timeline becomes almost unbearably tight. Billy Jean Floyd turned 18 years old on March 5, 2025. According to his own obituary, that birthday came and went just days before his death. 3 days after he became a legal adult, Billy Floyd was killed. 3 days. If you're the kind of person who believes in coincidences, this is a hard one to swallow. A boy turns 18. Days later, while the husband of the woman he was allegedly involved with is away, Billy ends up back at the house on Powerline Road. And within hours he's dead, his body stuffed into a trash can. We don't know and may never fully know whether Jonathan Belk was tracking the calendar, waiting specifically for this window to open. But the timing alone is the kind of detail that prosecutors build entire theories of premeditation around. It's the difference between a crime of passion defense, the idea that a man stumbled onto an unbearable betrayal and snapped in the heat of the moment, and a case for first-degree murder built on the argument that this violence had been decided upon and simply delayed for a year and a half. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story, and while you're typing that out, I want to know what you think. Does the timing here, an alleged threat made a year and a half in advance, followed by a killing just 3 days after Billy's 18th birthday, sound like a sudden crime of passion to you? Or does it sound like something that was calculated and simply waiting for the right moment? Drop your theory in the comments because we are far from done unpacking this one. Now let's walk through what actually happened on that Saturday morning in March. Jonathan Belk had reportedly been away on a trip. With her husband out of town, Jada Golston allegedly invited Billy Floyd back to the home on Powerline Road in the Fredonia community, just outside Dunlap, Tennessee. It's a quiet, rural stretch. The kind of area where a homicide isn't just rare, it's the kind of thing that shakes an entire community for years. But Belk's trip didn't keep him away as long as expected. Investigators say he returned home unexpectedly and walked in on his wife and Billy Floyd together in bed. What followed, according to authorities, was a violent assault against both of them. At around 7 o'clock that Saturday morning, officers were notified that Jada Golston had shown up at a local emergency room in Dunlap, suffering from stab wounds. According to police records, she initially gave investigators a very different account of what had happened. She reportedly told them that an unidentified man had attacked her and her boyfriend while they were in bed together, and that this stranger had kept stabbing him. She told investigators she didn't even know if her boyfriend, meaning Billy, was still alive. It's worth sitting with that detail for a moment. In her initial account to police, Jada didn't identify her attacker as her husband. She described a mystery assailant. Whether that was confusion, fear, an attempt at self-protection, or something else entirely, is something only she can answer. But it's a detail that stands out sharply against everything investigators would uncover just a short time later. While Golston was at the hospital telling this story, deputies were being dispatched to the home on Powerline Road. When they arrived, they didn't find any mystery attacker fleeing the scene. What they found was Jonathan Belk, standing in his own doorway, covered in blood, with cuts on his hands. He told the officers on scene that he was Jada's husband. Inside the home, in the bedroom, deputies made the discovery that would come to define this case in headlines across the country. The body of 18-year-old Billy Jean Floyd, stuffed inside a trash can, positioned in the fetal position. He had suffered multiple severe stab wounds. Investigators believe Belk assaulted both his wife and Billy during this confrontation, stabbing Jada, who survived with non-life-threatening injuries, and killing Billy in what appears to have been a prolonged and brutal attack, given the severity and number of wounds described in reporting on the case. The image of a young man's body folded into a trash can is, frankly, one of the most disturbing details in a case full of disturbing details. It raises uncomfortable questions that go beyond the initial act of violence itself. Why take the additional step of moving the body, positioning it, concealing it that way? Was this panic, an attempt to buy time, or was it something colder? A final act of degradation directed at a boy Belk apparently blamed for the collapse of his marriage? Those are questions the courts, not internet commentators, will ultimately have to weigh. But they're impossible to ignore. At the time this story broke, the murder weapon itself had reportedly not been recovered. Sheriff Phillips confirmed that investigators were still actively searching for the knife used in the attack, which adds another layer of unresolved detail to an already chaotic scene. Jonathan Belk was taken into custody and booked into the Sequatchie County Jail, facing multiple charges, including criminal homicide. But it's what happened during his initial questioning that turned this from a local Tennessee homicide into a story that spread across national outlets. According to the police report obtained by news stations covering the case, deputies asked Belk a fairly standard question during processing, whether he had any concerns outside of his legal troubles. It's the kind of question investigators sometimes ask to gauge a suspect's state of mind, to see what's actually weighing on them in the aftermath of something this serious. Most people in that position might express concern about their family, their future, their freedom. What Belk reportedly said was this, that he was worried about his relationship with his wife, due to the fact that he had, in his own words, offed him. Read that again. In the immediate aftermath of allegedly killing an 18-year-old and stabbing his own wife, when asked what was weighing on him, Jonathan Beluk's answer wasn't about the young man he had just killed. It wasn't remorse, and it wasn't fear of prison. It was, according to the police report, concern about whether his marriage would survive this. It's the kind of statement that doesn't need much editorializing, because it speaks for itself. It suggests, at least in that raw and unfiltered moment, where Beluk's priorities were sitting. Not with the life that had just been lost, not even, really, with his own legal jeopardy, with the marriage, the very relationship that Billy Floyd's presence in that bed had allegedly threatened. This quote spread rapidly once it became public, and it's easy to understand why. It captures something almost impossible to script, a level of self-focus so total that it eclipsed even the awareness of what he had just done to another human being. If this were the only violent incident connected to Jonathan Beluk, you might be tempted to write it off as an isolated explosion. A man who had never shown signs of danger before, pushed past his breaking point by an unbearable betrayal. But according to people who know him, this was not the first time Beluk's jealousy over Jada had turned violent. A woman named Angie Cash told reporters she wasn't surprised at all when she heard Beluk had been arrested for murder. She said his history should have been a warning sign long before Billy Floyd ever died. According to Cash, roughly 12 years before the killing on Powerline Road, her own son, who was just 16 years old at the time, was attacked by Jonathan Beluk inside a Walmart. Beluk was around 29 at the time. The reported trigger for that attack was Jada. Beluk apparently believed the teenage boy had been staring at his wife and responded with violence right there in the store. Sit with that for a second, because it maps almost perfectly onto the pattern that would eventually end in Billy Floyd's death. More than a decade before this homicide, Beluk was already someone who responded to perceived threats involving his wife and teenage boys with physical violence. In a public retail store, no less. Not exactly a setting where most people feel comfortable escalating to an assault. That earlier incident, if accurately reported, suggests this wasn't a man discovering a capacity for violence for the first time in March of 2025. It suggests a pattern, one that stretched across more than a decade, always seemingly connected to the same trigger: jealousy tied to his wife and younger males. Angie Cash put it simply. She said this tragedy hits close to home for her, given what happened to her own son all those years earlier. Regardless of what Billy Floyd was allegedly involved in with Jada, she said, "A young man is now dead." And there had been warning signs about Beluk's temper for over a decade that apparently went unaddressed. This is one of the more uncomfortable threads running through this case. It's easy, in true crime coverage, to focus entirely on the shock value of the final act. The trash can, the infamous quote, the age gap at the center of the alleged affair. But a pattern of violence stretching back 12 years raises a much harder question. How many warning signs does a community absorb before something like this becomes inevitable? As this case moves through the Tennessee court system, it's likely to hinge on one central legal question: was this a crime of passion, or was it premeditated murder? Beluk's defense may lean heavily on the framing that has followed this case from the very beginning, that he was a husband who came home unexpectedly and discovered his wife in bed with another man. Tennessee law, like many states, recognizes the concept of sudden passion as a mitigating factor that can reduce a homicide charge from murder down to voluntary manslaughter. The theory behind sudden passion is that certain provocations, discovering a spouse's infidelity in the act being one of the classic, if legally controversial examples, can send a reasonable person into a state where their actions aren't the product of cold calculation, but of overwhelming, uncontrollable emotion in the heat of the moment. If Beluk's legal team pursues this route, expect them to lean hard into the imagery of walking in on his wife and an 18-year-old together, the shock and betrayal of that moment, and the argument that whatever happened next wasn't planned. It was a man's mind breaking under an unbearable discovery. But the state has a very different story to tell, and it's built on details we've already covered. If prosecutors can establish that Belulk made a specific, credible threat roughly a year and a half before the killing, that he told people close to Billy that he intended to kill him the moment he turned 18, that single piece of testimony could dismantle the sudden passion defense almost entirely. Sudden passion, by definition, requires the violence to be a spontaneous reaction to a triggering event, not the execution of a plan that had been sitting, fully formed, for 18 months. And then there's the timing itself. Billy turned 18 on March 5th. He was killed just 3 days later, at a moment when Belulk was reportedly out of town and then returned unexpectedly. Was Belulk simply unlucky enough to come home early on the one weekend his wife invited Billy over? Or did he engineer circumstances, consciously or not, that led to this exact confrontation happening within days of Billy legally becoming an adult, the moment Belulk had allegedly said he was waiting for? These are the exact questions a jury will eventually have to wrestle with, and there are still significant pieces of this puzzle that remain unresolved. For one, the murder weapon has reportedly not been recovered, which complicates the physical evidence side of the prosecution's case. For another, as of the most recent reporting available, Jada Golston herself has not faced formal charges related to allegations of a sexual relationship with a minor, even though her own husband's defense and the broader public narrative around this case orbit almost entirely around that alleged relationship. Sheriff Phillips has stated that the investigation remains active and that additional charges are anticipated as more interviews are conducted. But as it stands, the legal consequences in this case have so far fallen entirely on Belulk. And then there's Billy's family, left to navigate all of this in the middle of unimaginable grief. His godmother, Brandy Smart, has been one of the most vocal sources speaking publicly about the alleged relationship and the threats that reportedly preceded Billy's death. His mother, Rachel Marie Floyd, has shared tributes to her son on social media in the aftermath of his death, remembering him not as a headline or a case number, but as her child. A young man who, according to his obituary, spent his short life doing the things he loved: hunting, fishing, four-wheeling, working on engines, and being with the people who cared about him. That's the tension sitting at the heart of this entire case, and it's one that true crime audiences often struggle to hold at the same time. Billy Floyd may have allegedly been involved in a relationship that started when he was far too young to legally consent to it, a relationship that, if the allegations are accurate, constitutes the exploitation of a child by an adult. And at the exact same time, Billy Floyd is a homicide victim. An 18-year-old, barely 18, 3 days into adulthood, who was killed and whose body was found stuffed into a trash can. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. He can be someone who, according to the people who loved him, was allegedly the victim of exploitation as a minor. And he can also be a young man whose life was violently taken from him just days after he became a legal adult, in a killing his family is still fighting to fully understand. As of the most recent reporting on this case, Jonathan Belulk remains in custody at the Sequatchie County Jail, facing criminal homicide charges tied to the death of Billy Jean Floyd, along with charges related to the stabbing of his wife. The investigation into the broader circumstances surrounding this case, including the alleged years-long relationship between Jada Golston and Billy Floyd, and the specific age at which it reportedly began, remains active, with Sheriff Phillips indicating that additional charges are possible as investigators continue conducting interviews. The murder weapon has not been publicly confirmed as recovered. The full scope of who else, if anyone, may eventually face charges connected to this case is still unfolding. And a community in Sequatchie County, a small rural corner of Tennessee where a homicide like this doesn't just make headlines, it reshapes how neighbors see each other, is left trying to process how a family friend, a husband, a man some people had known for years, ended up standing in his own doorway covered in blood, with a teenager's body stuffed into a trash can just feet away. What we're left with is a case defined by contradictions. A husband who allegedly threatened murder 18 months in advance, yet may argue in court that what happened was a sudden, unplanned act of passion. A wife who initially told police a stranger was responsible before the true nature of what happened at that home came to light. And a teenage boy, someone's son, someone's godson, a kid who liked fixing engines and spending weekends outdoors, who became entangled in an adult relationship years before he was legally able to consent to one, and who ultimately paid for whatever happened inside that house with his life. Jonathan Belulk expressed concern for his marriage, but an 18-year-old boy lost his life, allegedly after being drawn into a 3-year relationship with a married woman more than a decade older than him. A relationship that, according to those closest to him, began when he was still a child. Thank you for watching Brian's Criminal Unmasking. If this case breakdown kept you engaged from start to finish, do me a favor and hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe for more deep dives into complex, disturbing, and often overlooked criminal cases just like this one. Before you go, I want to hear from you. Do you think Jada Golston should face legal consequences of her own in connection with this case, given the allegations surrounding Billy's age when this relationship reportedly began? Do you think Jonathan Belulk's defense has any real shot at reducing this from murder down to manslaughter, given the alleged year-and-a-half-old threat hanging over this case? Sound off in the comments below, and let's talk about it. I'll see you in the next episode.